And as always, we have a thigh-splatteringly good time for you coming up this week on Radio Flange Goblet. Periodically, we'll be dipping back into our post-game Super Bowl analysis with Lionel Cheft, Craig Spling, Bernie Jefferson, Rupert Bang Twice on the Door If You Love Me Baby, and Token Woman Edwina Volva, who are bringing you up-to-the-minute post-game discussion for the next 98 straight hours from a dingy closet somewhere near the Dunkin' Donuts on I-94.
Well, I agree, Rupert. It was definitely football in the making.
And history in the making, too, Lionel. I would have to say, Lionel, that both football and history were being made as we watched it simply 36 hours ago. During the football game they called the Super Bowl.
I like the halftime show. I thought the music, message, talent, ability...
Edwina, we're only talking about the game.
Do you mean the game where some men found a space, fell over in it, and occasionally ran a little?
You can't simplify it like that, Edwina.
I think what Lionel, Craig, and Rupert are trying to say, Edwina, is there was a game played on Sunday, a historic game. A game where two football teams played a game. A game of football. Some may say a game played partially with your feet, and mostly with a ball. Two teams entered. One was victorious, but the game was most definitely football.
But I think, Bernie, we can all agree it wasn't just simply football.
That's right, Craig. I'd have to say it was definitely football in the making.
Then at 9 p.m. on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday, it's our very own dating reality TV show. We take 47-foot doctors, put them up in a moderately priced travel lodge, and occasionally let them eat out at the local steakhouse when they've saved up enough coupons. They have 28 straight weeks to get to know each other and decide which two will be going home together. Yes, based on the successful UK show Sharappa-Date, it's our very own podiatrist. That's Trist with a Y.
Well, I like her, I really do, but I think she needs to stand on her own 2 feet.
Yeah, and Sharon is so demanding. I'd hate to be wrapped around her little toe.
Glendola is pretty, especially around the ankles, and I'd like to plant as her fasciitis, if you know what I'm saying. I don't mean to be corny.
Oh, you're such a heel, Jeffrey.
I really am very sorry.
And then finally, at 10:30 p.m. on the third Sunday after Pentecost, it's our quick-fire evening of programming, where for 30 minutes, we'll be playing a few sections each of the following shows. Where's My Accordion, Lewis? All in the Bag with Clifton Lifton. Rub-a-dub-dub, 3 men in an elevator filled with heroin and some dogs. It's My Spanner with Ernold Warmhusset. Cooking pork in a caravan near some wild goats with Fenella Peppy Chot. My Wrist, Your Face. It all comes down to the meat whistle, repeatedly punching Nazis with 64 million eager snowflakes, inside Terence Stamp's lobby and other famous vestibules. The Filthy Spelling Bee with dyslexic porn stars and Ryan Gosling. Violin Trade with Cleffa Teffa. All the queens and all the spleens. Behind the Couch with Loose Change and the Dirty Lints. I Was a Brexit Denier Who Now Lives in Paraguay. Polishing Brian Wick. And Music Quiz Flick Ping. Margaret. But first, before all that can happen, it's the After Movie Dino, which this week is accompanied by the ever-increasingly noisy death rattle of Western civilization, and any reasonable tolerance for this mind-fuckingly mad shit.
You're listening to the sweet sounds of the After Movie Diner with your host, Jon Cross.
Hello, yes, it's me, Jon Cross. And I just wanted to make this brief announcement because I called up Douglas-tilley, as I'm wont to do when I want to talk about films like
Scream Blacula Scream, and I thought, well, who better to talk about, a pioneering African-American horror film from the 70s, but a person who's even whiter than me, a Canadian. But still, I called him up, and as people like Doug and I are wont to do, because, quite honestly, with the world in the state that it is, when people like Doug and I get together, we do tend to talk about it. We do tend to just go, oh, for goodness sake, did you see what happened today? Yep, it's absolutely insane. I'm not going to play all of that, don't worry, it's not going to be the big political thing, it's a film show. It is a film show, and there'll be plenty about film. But just to kind of put it into context, and to contexts? Just to put it into contexts, or contents, just to put it into context. See what I did there? Okay, great. I just wanted to play a few highlights from that preamble, and then we'll move almost seamlessly, you won't even notice, into this week's show about Scream Blacula Scream. But sometimes you just have to vent, don't you? And the world is in a situation whether you want to acknowledge it or not. And I do happen to care, just a teensy-weensy tiny bit about it, as does Douglas.
Is that Jon Cross?
Hey, Jill, how are you?
He's asking Jill, how are you?
He's asking me how I am?
Yeah, how are you?
Oh, I'm American, so I'm ashamed and sad.
Yeah, well, I'm English, but I live in America, and my country is also fucking things up, so I'm doubly ashamed.
He's doubly ashamed.
Well, my big hope was never based on one exact person, but it was always based on the fact that 50 years ago, the world was a lot worse than it is today. And statistically, even if people weren't feeling it in their wallets or in their hearts or in their homes, statistically, everything was better. We were safer, we were better, and therefore the future always looked to be improving, even if it was two steps forward, one step back.
Sure.
The future was always written by the people tearing down the walls, not building them. And then everything in 2016 went, no, I'm sorry, you can't believe that. Here is the reason why you can't believe that.
It's amazing how much my whole worldview has changed over the last year,
Right.
Yeah.
And you're right. And it's not even just a case between optimism and pessimism. It really comes down to the idea that I have no plans on having children in my lifetime, but I'd like to think that even if there are aspects of the world that for the next generation we're going to be left worse off, that at least there was an awareness of what was causing that to be, and that we could do some things to address it. And then that's completely out the window, to the point where not only are we not trying to help, there's actively hurting happening all the time.
Doug, America first. America first.
Yeah, and like
I kind of get annoyed with us as well, even though I agree with what we're saying. I get annoyed with us as lefty, liberal, whatever you want to call us. I like to call us just human realists, but
right.
or like scientists or whatever. But like people have dubbed us wishy-washy liberals, so fine, I'll carry that mantle. But even I get kind of annoyed with us sometimes, where every tiny little thing has to be a discussion. And the only reason I get wound up about that is because as someone who loves comedy, it makes having a sense of humor very difficult. If absolutely everything is off the table because absolutely anything might offend and or oppress someone, it sort of becomes a little tricky to kind of make jokes about stuff.
I mean, it's really no different than it ever was, in the sense that there are always going to be people who speak out against or maybe feel sensitive about certain things, and you just have to be brave enough to say, well, I'm just going to say it anyway, and just the consequences are the consequences. But the thing is, empathy is complex. Hate is really simple, right? It's really easy to mobilize around hate, but when it comes to empathy, it means that everyone has a different variation on it and a different level, so it's going to be really complex, because once you start saying we should care about other people, then that opens up everybody.
And I have to examine aspects of my own life
That's right.
consider my own position in this society and accept that perhaps I was given certain rights and privileges above other people, and that's not a meritocracy, so I don't want to think about that.
Yeah.
I even find myself, like, I was having a discussion. What was I having a discussion about the other night? Evil Dead with my friend, my cousin Michael, who's also from Canada.
Right.
And
I forget what we were talking. Oh yeah, we were talking about like the whole tree rape scene and the time that was done in, and how Sam Raimi felt then and how he felt now, and da-da-da-da-da. And we were talking about like a whole bunch of stuff. And I just found myself like tripping over my own tongue and doubling back on things and having to go over things and excusing stuff and da-da-da-da-da. And I just remember a time when I could just go, and that happened in a movie, and on we go, and we accept that it was just a scene in a movie. Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean. I don't necessarily agree. I think the complexity of it is annoying. It can be really difficult to maneuver around it. But I think recognizing when things are problematic, but also saying, I can still appreciate this, even if there's an element of it that I don't necessarily still connect with or I maybe disagree with. I think the problem is that we talk in absolutes, right? So if I find out that Russ Meyer was a piece of shit and treated actresses like crap on and was a sexist and was just a garbage person. Well, as long as he wasn't a criminal person and someone that I feel I don't want to support financially, then I can still watch his movies and find elements to appreciate while still acknowledging that there are parts of it that I really don't like,
Wait. So you're saying if someone's a misogynist, as long as they haven't gone outside the realms of law, you're okay with financially supporting them?
I'm saying that if that's just because someone is a misogynist doesn't necessarily mean that their art is misogynist, because I would imagine.
Yes, it does, because it's coming from a misogynist person, which is always going to have that bent on it.
But the thing is, if you talk about a film like Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, which has been used as a feminist statement, that people can interpret it that way and has been for 50 years.
People can interpret things all different ways.
Yeah, of course they can.
But what I mean is, why would you financially, what if someone was racist, but they never broke the law?
Think about John Ford. John Ford was racist. He was.
Clint Eastwood is racist.
Clint Eastwood is racist?
Yeah, I think he guy's a douchebag. I don't watch his movies.
I mean, so many homophobic.
Right, but Jill, that's your choice, and we completely and utterly understand and respect that. But I also feel this way too, that while I am, and I mean genuinely, 100% for equality and empathy and humanity and all the rest of it, I am genuinely in my heart. I feel that, and I try and live that way, a non-judgmental way. There are certain traits in human nature that no matter how, and I'm not justifying anything, I'm simply trying to state a reality. There are certain traits that while we can put mind over matter, of course we can, and while we can logically sort things out and all the rest of it, there are certain traits both in our history and in our scientific chemical makeup that can't be denied, but should at least be recognized. And therefore, if we start striking everyone off the books forever having an even slightly misogynistic thought or even a slightly racist thought or even a whatever kind of thought, you're striking 99.8% of people off the books.
Right. And you know what? I'm with you there 100%. I mean, we don't need a version of The Evil Dead that has edited out that scene because it makes people uncomfortable now and maybe shouldn't have been there in the first place, depending on what your point of view is. But the fact is, it exists. It's still something we can talk about and discuss, but it doesn't necessarily have to be analyzed to death every single time you watch it just because it exists.
Right, and I was just saying at the time that they made it, he was 18 or 19 or however old Sam Raimi was. And there is that thing where you're an 18, 19-year-old and you're making a horror movie in the woods with your friends. You're like, hey, what if we do this with some vines and a girl and breasts? Because you're an 18, 19-year-old boy and you're scum of the earth. Like, we're all scum of the earth. Mm-hmm. Like, there's no getting over it. We have mischievous thoughts. Human beings have mischievous thoughts. And acting it out in art is so much more preferable to acting it out in reality. And that's kind of like art. The reason why people are drawn to horror movies, action movies, sci-fi movies, whatever it is it's a catharsis as much as it's anything else. It's purging those thoughts that human nature innately has in our, lizard or Cro-Magnon brain that we need to kind of get out and explore without physically doing it in real life. And I think that by denying that men have that, and even denying that women have certain things as well about them, is even more dangerous. And not denying it, but not accepting it, is even more dangerous. We have to kind of embrace that. And therefore, there has to be a shorthand. And when you say we talk in absolutes, I think it's more that we talk in generalities. than absolutes. A lot of people go, oh, I fucking hate that. They don't really mean they fucking hate that. It's just so much easier than breaking down every tiny little thought they might have about it. And it's not that they're talking in an absolute, because ultimately if they had a gun to their head, they wouldn't go, oh, okay, I don't hate Hack Snyder. Please, don't shoot me in the face.
I mean, I think it goes back to it takes a lot more time and a lot more effort to think about things in a three-dimensional and complex way. And frankly, it wouldn't make sense for us to always discuss things on that level, right? Because otherwise you'll never get anywhere. I always feel like that's one of the biggest difficulties about being on the left, is that they tend to when I think there's more of an effort to not generalize, but because of that, it means it takes a lot longer to do anything. When on the right, they can come together because a lot of their issues in their brains are so clear-cut.
So simple. Right. No, that's completely true. Oh, if you're being a dick about it, you're being a dick about it, and someone needs to punch you in the face.
And I think actually that's what it comes down to. It's like there's no reason to be a dick about people who are all just trying to do their best. And as long as you're just making an effort, then let's just I think we can bond on the making an effort side of things, because the fact is, I'm a fucking idiot.
Oh yeah, no, I mean the whole Trump presidency is putting out so many lies and making so many insane decisions a day that literally the media cannot catch up anymore. I mean, it is just a chaotic, insane. I can't go near it. I mean, someone, so I used to joke. I used to say, oh, I keep my toe in on the news just to feel informed and know where I should be and what I should be doing. And I'm like, the trouble is keeping your toe in it now. Your toe's singed off because it's acid. You're putting your toe in acid. It's not even like and it's unbearable. It's detrimental to people's mental health. It's detrimental to people's daily lives. It's detrimental to people's relationships, let alone all the other stuff we have to fight, the economy and equality and the environment and all the other stuff. People just being bombarded by this shit, whether it's social media or physical media or TV or whatever, people being bombarded by this, it's a detriment to people's daily existence. It's not helping anyone. At some point, someone somewhere needs to step back and take a deep breath and actually formulate a plan.
Right.
That's all I think.
Let's hope it happens.
I just come from a place where there is humor and reality that needs to kind of also be like, there's a human nature and there's a humanity and there's a reality and a humor that needs to kind of be accepted. So I can't always go completely one way on something. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean. It's there's a conflict that's always happening with me as well, especially because I feel like I'm a different person than I was a year ago, and a very different person than I was 2 years ago. And it's an evolution. And I think about some of my opinions even from 2 years ago, and I think I don't recognize where those came from. It also comes from exposure to certain. I mean, I work at a university now, so I'm exposed to a lot of young people. But honestly, even though that's in some ways distressing because they don't know who A Tribe Called Quest are or anything like that, but there's also, I feel like, and maybe it's just the perspective of being at a university and it's a whole different
I love how you pulled out like the whitest, most Canadian reference.
No, that is legitimately what happened in a class this week.
No, I know. I'm joking. Yeah, carry on.
No, just the idea that I feel like they've already turned a corner on a lot of this stuff, and they just need to wait. We just need to wait for certain people to get out of the way, and maybe we'll be all right in the long run. But
that's
right
how
now,
it's interesting that you're saying kids are saying that, because that's how I felt for 15 years. Like, whenever I became aware of. Whenever I stopped saying what my parents and teachers had been saying, and when I started saying what I felt, that's how I felt politically. I have felt, what the fuck is taking so long on this shit? Like, why is abortion or women's rights? I forget calling it abortion, but why is women's gynecological rights, a right to choose? Why is that even a discussion anymore? Why is separation of church and state even a discussion anymore? Why is the environment even a discussion anymore?
It's unbelievable that it feels like things that we had kind of settled and closed the book on, and now it's all been opened up again. And it's just, and not that those issues were so settled that no one was ever talking about them, but the fact that we're still talking about now abortion rights is just,
right?
It just makes me feel like not only are we taking a step back, it's like a 30-year step back every single time anything happens. And it feels like even the people who are like really happy about this, even they're confused. It's like, oh, we're doing this now? I thought that was done. I thought that we were never going to be able to. I mean, it's a real hard place that we are right now. And when I say we, I mean we. I mean, even though I'm in Canada and what happens in the United States is supposed to be centered on that country, the fact is everything that's happening there is affecting everybody. Yeah. And I mean, and honestly, our politicians here in Canada, our right-wing politicians are becoming more and more right-wing. We see it happening in France. I see it happening in Australia. I mean, you see it happening around the world, and I feel like it just kind of emboldens them to say all that shit that they were thinking but not saying before.
And I'm also amazed at people's energy and enthusiasm and fight. Meaning on our side, on the positive side, on the, I'm amazed people still have it. I was tired by these debates 10 years ago. By this point, I am flabbergastingly exhausted by them. And the idea that there's even more fighting and even more protesting and even more work to be done just makes me think, like, when do I get to just sit, do my job, come home, cuddle my dog? You know, like,
I sometimes think how much easier it would be to just say, well, I'm in it for me. You know, right. I'm a white guy in his mid to late 30s. I'm just going to relax because, hey, things are not going to turn for me in my lifetime in a way that's probably going to be so crushing that it's going to make it impossible for me to earn a living or something like that.
Right.
But it's when you think outside that sphere, that's when you start to connect with other people and be like, well, you know, I'm the person who has the privilege to be able to say something and do something and make some sort of statement, then I better do it, because do I want 30 years down the road when people might be even in worse states than they are right now to be like, oh, I didn't do anything when that was happening.
Right. Why were they so afraid? Why? Like, because one of the things he's traded on more than anything has been fear. This idea that America wasn't working, the world wasn't working, that we were minutes away from Armageddon. Like, no, we weren't. No, we weren't. Nothing supports that. Nothing at any point supports that belief whatsoever. It is a massive, massive lie of fear on an absolutely invisible floor, and yet somehow it maintained enough that 60% of people or 55% of people went, yeah, I think we want this guy in office. I'm like, what? Who? I don't understand it.
I think back to the debates and all the conversation where he would say, you know, that crime rates had increased when they had actually decreased, or unemployment rates had increased when they had actually decreased. And it was just, he would just say it again and again and again. And every time he said it, after it, there'd be someone saying, well, no, that's not true. Obviously, here's the statistic that show that they're not true. And it didn't matter that it wasn't true. It just didn't matter anymore.
Well, because he cried when someone said that to him. He went, oh, look how the media bully me. The media bully me. The media bully me. He made himself...
Don't pay attention to what the media say.
But what I don't understand about that is, how did he make himself a victim and then run on a platform of strength? Like,
mocking people for considering themselves snowflakes when everything all he does is complain about people treading on him.
Anyway, now that we're thoroughly and utterly depressed with a complete lack of hope, let's go back to a time where a group of enterprising actors and filmmakers and just wonderful creative people took their culture and took the reins of their creativity and got, for a brief, glorious moment on a shining hill, to get movies out into theaters that were about them and for them. And that is the wonderful Blaxploitation, and I use that in a positive way, Blaxploitation era film, Scream Blacula Scream, starring the wonderful Pam Grier.
I wouldn't necessarily say starring Pam Grier.
No, but she is. if we're going to give a name of someone who's in this movie, and also because it is Women in Horror Month,
that's a good point.
As Black History Month, so the whole reason why we're doing this is that.
Who dares touch these rotting bones? Who dares call forth the most horrible specter of the damned? Now he's back. The Black Prince of Darkness, Blacula, recalled by the awesome powers of voodoo to stalk the earth in a new quest for blood. Blacula, Dracula's soul brother, seething with hate, obsessed with vengeance, craving young bodies, lusting for hot blood to create new victims for the legions of the undead.
And with evil vampires. Good. That gives you something of an edge over the rest.
William Marshall, again, as the Lord of the Vampires, in a relentless search for Pam Grier, the exciting star of Coffee.
I need you!
Now he is back. Ever more evil, ever more fearful than ever before. Scream Blacula Scream, the bloodiest legend of our time.
This is from, it's sort of mid-era. Again, just to explain people who haven't listened to my previous episodes on this era of filmmaking, I'm with Fred Williamson on this subject, which is blaxploitation doesn't mean that anyone was exploiting anyone, because everyone got paid and everyone had a good career and everyone was able to start jobs off this. It's more in the way that it was films made predominantly by the African American community that had exploitative elements, which, right, as we both know, Doug, in cinema mean violence, sexuality, drug use, that kind of stuff. Exploitative element. So when you say Ozploitation, it doesn't mean that Australia was being exploited. It means right, that there was exploitation things in the films, and they were made in Australia. With blaxploitation, that's how I look at it. I also look at it not as a genre, but as an era. Because, for example, this is a horror movie, but Shaft isn't a horror movie, so you can't say blaxploitation as a genre. You can say it's an era. That's how I come at it anyway.
I mean, frankly, the idea of categorizing something like Dolomite or Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song or Shaft and Scream Blacula Scream and saying, well, they're all part of the same thing. Well, how can you even say that? They're all completely different movies with completely different subject matter, with completely different casts. Yeah. It almost does them a disservice to kind of lump them together as if they're thematically similar.
Of course, and I completely agree with that. I use the term, again, more as an umbrella term for an era that, A, I wish had lasted a lot longer, and B, which is sort of unique. We haven't had really, I mean, it's not unique like we say we've had Ozploitation. There's even Canucksploitation and other stuff like that. And it certainly comes about at a time when B-movies, genre movies, grindhouse movies, exploitation movies were at their height anyway. But unique in a way that we haven't had, for example, a period in Western culture, which Hollywood movies are predominantly Western culture, in which, let's say, there's been 5 years of movies specifically by and for the Native American community or the Asian community or whatever it is. There's Hong Kong films and there's Bollywood films, and those films have traveled, and that's fantastic. But it's not quite the same. Do you know what I mean? That
absolutely, because because you could say that Blaxploitation gave way to a kung fu boom, but really that was bringing in martial arts films from outside. And when they made local ones in the United States, then they almost always tried to cast a white actor in the lead. They basically tried to take the elements of it and then Americanize it. I'm putting that in quotation marks, of course. But the thing is, with Blaxploitation, you couldn't do that because part of what made them special was the culture that hadn't really been shown on screen before, and the attitudes behind that, and of course the cast as well. So it's not something that they could kind of, even though they did try to kind of water it down by making, much more palatable versions of these kind of movies, the ones that people remember tend to be the more hard-edged ones.
Yeah. I mean, I can't even think, you'd probably know better than I am, but I can't even think a time where, because obviously there's a lot of Spanish language in the US as well. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of Mexicans and a lot of Hispanics and Latinos and so on. There hasn't ever really been a solid kind of 5 years or 6 years of Latino movies or Hispanic movies in that regard. I mean, the only other time we get something that comes like this is, I guess, the sort of what people look at as sort of the Spike Lee era, which is sort of the early 90s, where you have a lot of those films that interestingly, with Blaxploitation, you're looking at predominantly genre films. Even the gangster films or there aren't, a lot of people think of them as like, oh, it's all films about pimps and hookers and drug dealing. It really isn't at all in any way in that regard, and certainly not in any kind of serious socio-political way.
Right.
Whereas the early 90s boom of African-American filmmaking tends to be more socio-political. It tends to be showing the reality of the situation. And even if it has a crime element or a heist element or whatever it is, it's still more about that nothing had changed, that these situations still existed, the ghetto situation still existed, the poverty, the all that, the oppression and so on still existed.
There's certainly a lot more overtly political. I think Blaxploitation movies, by their design, even when the plots have no political elements of it, there's always something political about it. Like even in this movie, where you see, just because of the relationships between the white and black characters in those movies, but certainly they're made a lot more overt, and probably because they did evolve out of a filmmaker that is so political, like Spike Lee. And when you think of those early 90s movies like Boys to the Hood or New Jack City or Juice and movies like that they're a lot more directly angry, and they're also really about that specific time and place. One of the interesting things about Blaxploitation movies is that they weren't all contemporary, right? They're really telling all sorts of different stories, but they're really just black cinema, right? It's movies that traditionally had starred white actors, and now we're seeing them with black actors in a black context, and that is what makes them so interesting. I mean, of course, they vary hugely in quality, just like every other genre does and every other era does. But we're lucky enough to have this collection of movies that represent that time and place that we can kind of go back to and see. In some ways you can see how far we've come, and in other ways how we haven't.
Right. And I think that, I don't know about you, but and I probably won't keep in that long political discourse that we had at the start of the show. I will maybe keep some of it in. But like we were talking earlier, for the listeners who don't know, we were talking earlier about sort of the difficulty right now between, needing empathy and realism and all the rest of it, but also being able to be entertaining or be humorous or be creative in that way. And there are two mindsets to some extent that are interchangeable. There is we need to make cinema about important topics to get the message across. So whether it's 12 Years a Slave or whether it's Selma or whether it's, like you said, Boys in the Hood or whatever, back in the day. And I slightly lean more on this side, that if you're showing, one of the greatest things about Blaxploitation to some extent was that the audience wasn't uniquely African American. The audience was very broad for these films. Everyone went and saw them on 42nd Street. It wasn't just in the same way that when the Kung Fu boom happened, everyone went to see them. It wasn't just an Asian audience. It was a broad audience. And genre has a way, if you go, it's a vampire movie, people go, okay, it doesn't matter really who it stars, because ultimately you're going there to see the vampires. If you say it's a gangster film, or you say it's an action film, or you say whatever, as long as the dude who is the good guy at the beginning is the good guy at the end beating up the bad guy, like, that's all audiences really care about. And there's something more unifying about that if you start to, and you can always whip in, like you say, there's even a scene in this film where they whip in a bit of message. But if you can whip in a little underlying subtext to educate the audience while also making like a kick-ass genre film, I almost think that's, not that I want to really compare them, but that's almost a better way, to my mind, or to my way of thinking, in unifying an audience and bringing around diversity to all corners, rather than you say to someone, well, this is about the race riots, or this is about slavery, or this is about whatever, and people, if they have no interest in that, if they have no interest in being educated about that, they're not going to watch that film. But if you go, this is a vampire movie, they might go, oh, great.
Sure. I mean, I think you're right in some ways. I think that there's a place for those kind of movies too, certainly. But I tend to agree that when it comes to changing a mass audience's opinion on something, that it's better, instead of doing a message movie, it's to have a movie with an underlying message, right? So it doesn't have to overtake it and be entirely about it, because the fact is, the audiences that would go to see a message movie like a Selma or 12 Years a Slave, if you already had a very strong negative opinion towards black people because you're an asshole white supremacist piece of shit, you're not going to see those movies. Right. However, if someone maybe told that person, hey, we got this kick-ass vampire movie that you got to see, they might see it, right? Because there's no suggestion that they're going to be kind of presented with that message straight up. And then when they watch it, and it creates a three-dimensional character, and it creates empathy for these characters, and you can recognize something in them that you maybe didn't see before. Maybe there is a possibility of a greater level of change in that person, and at least we can hope for that.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is from a like I say, middle class male white perspective.
Yeah, right?
So I'm only saying it from a sort of human logical. It would stand to reason that this would be true, in the same way that Fred Williamson, the Hammer, has said multiple times, like, his movies to him were not about go get whitey. He beat everybody up in his films, and it was about, you either like me as an action hero or you don't. He also says, I'm an action hero that an audience that didn't have action heroes can now relate to, which I think is hugely important about his message in his films. But he never was overtly political in that sense.
I think Fred Williamson had a set of rules, and still does, when it comes to putting him in a film, that he has to get the girl and beat the bad guy at the end, which, in some ways you'd be like, well, that seems kind of limiting. It doesn't give a lot of creative freedom to the people who cast him. But on the other side, look, he came from an era where that wasn't going to happen. So when you made that hard rule, it's like, well, this is how I want to present myself. Like you said, he wasn't going out and trying to make an overtly political message movie, but by having those rules and asserting himself, then it's political on a different level.
Completely. And so we find ourselves at Scream Blacula Scream, which comes out in 1973, which, as I say, is sort of middle to almost, towards the end, only a couple of years before the end of the most successful run of these movies. I mean, they do blend into the late 70s and early 80s. And it's an interesting one because it comes out the same year as Coffee, which is sort of the movie that launches Pam Grier. Yet, as you intimated earlier, she's not a main role in this. She's very important to the plot, but
she's very featured in the movie. Certainly more so than a lot of the supporting actors and actresses.
Yeah. But after Coffee, you would more, she does then in 74 and 75 go on to do Foxy Brown, Sheba Baby, Friday Foster, where she's the lead. But, even after this, she does The Arena, where, again, that's like a Roger Corman, schlocky gladiator film. It's sort of a little odd that she would be doing, although these are all AIP movies, but, like, it seems odd that you would do something that's sort of so in a way, culturally relevant as Coffee.
Right.
And then go back to Scream Blacula Scream in the arena.
I think maybe there's an element of safety to it. I mean, this was a sequel to a very successful movie, and integrating, a rising star, someone who's just about to break into that cast. I mean, who knows? Maybe while they were making it, they might have even expanded the part slightly, because certainly the writing was on the wall that this was a special talent.
Yeah, and in fact, it's funny when Grier speaks herself about these films. She looked at her big break to some extent as Fort Apache the Bronx,
right?
Because she would be acting opposite Paul Newman. Mm-hmm. However, one can argue, considering in that she plays a prostitute with a drug problem, that it's the least decent representation of an African-American woman in a film. The fact that she happens to be starring with a big Hollywood star, I understand where she's coming from in terms of her career, but films like Coffee, Scream Blacula Scream, Foxy Brown, Bucktown, Friday Foster, and so on give a much more well-rounded and powerful representation of a woman, let alone an African-American woman, than playing a hooker with a drug problem. But,
I mean, certainly in this movie, she has a strength in her character, which you weren't seeing a lot of at that time. So obviously there was an attempt to kind of put her front and center. However, when you make a movie called Scream Blacula Scream and it's a sequel to Blacula, it's hard not to fixate and to focus and to put most of your attention onto that titular character. And I even though I enjoy Scream Blacula Scream, maybe not quite as much as I enjoy Blacula, it's the reason I enjoy it isn't because of Pam Grier, who doesn't have that much substance to her character, but it's because of William Marshall, who I think is so amazing as Blacula and such an incredible actor in all sorts of different ways. It's when he is one-on-one with characters in this movie, when he is talking directly to Pam Grier or he's talking to one of the other characters in just kind of a one-on-one scene, to me, that makes both of these movies.
Yeah, completely and utterly. I mean, William Marshall is an incredible presence. I mean, it's very interesting that this sort of is happening just as something like the Hammer films are winding down. Mm-hmm. Because in terms of gravitas and presence and delivery and all the rest of it, he's really up there with Christopher Lee to some extent.
Absolutely.
And that is high fucking praise considering how much regard I hold Christopher Lee in. But it's true. Like, to me, actually, the one thing that is missing from something like a Scream Blacula Scream is a counterpart to him. The reason why something like a Cushing and Lee partnership works so well is because you kind of love and root for both of them. And in this one, it's all about Blacula, really. The people he surrounds himself with, such as Richard Lawson as Willis, are pretty generic, you know what I mean? Caricature type people.
Especially because when we think of Dracula and we think about the kind of classic Bram Stoker novel version of Dracula, and in this movie they're trying to set up, Willis is sort of like going to be the Renfield, and that's how you're expecting it to play out. And I guess Pam Grier's character is sort of like Van Helsing, except not really. They're trying to do their own thing here. And what I like most,
Don Mitchell is probably more.
You're probably right. Maybe that's right. It kind of combines elements of them, especially because he's taking a more kind of direct approach at trying to solve the mystery, so to speak. What makes this movie so interesting, and it's also one of the things that's most frustrating about it, is that they really do make an attempt to humanize this Blacula character and try to give him some motivation, because the story here isn't very strong, right? Because it's a mystery that we already know the end of. It's people trying to reveal what's going on with these murders in town. But we find out that Blacula wants to connect and actually preserve Pam Grier's character Lisa because he's trying to basically get back he wants to get real death, I think is what the indication there, that he wants to escape this kind of existence that he has. And we even get a scene in this movie which is a total hero scene for Blacula, where he's accosted by two pimps on the street and he beats the shit out of them and bites their necks, and that's how that scene ends. And this is really an attempt to kind of heroize Blacula, much more so than in the first film. And I like the idea that they were trying to expand the mythology to some extent, but I do have to say that the scenes that William Marshall is not on screen in Scream Blacula Scream are not nearly as interesting as the ones where he is.
No, true. And in fact, that scene you just mentioned is sort of the one bit to some extent that is overtly political,
right?
Because he says you are, you're keeping our women in chains like slaves, and you're aping
Absolutely.
our slave masters rather than being your own person. And there is also this idea of trying to bring in sort of African tribal culture and voodoo culture and various other kind of strains of beliefs, religions, traditions, history, and so on, sort of into the Blacula myth.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so interesting because there's almost a voodoo, almost a zombie-ish aspect to the last few scenes of this movie when you see that all the transformed vampires all sort of slowly lumbering and attacking the police officers and other people who are in this large house. But I love that idea of incorporating sort of this voodoo myth into the vampire aspect.
Right, and one of the reasons why he wants to preserve Pam Grier is she has the name Lisa Fortier, which obviously has that nice sort of, I guess, French Louisiana kind of overtone to it, that she would be the most connected with the powers and the abilities of voodoo, and that she is a priestess to some extent, right? Mm-hmm. With his hope that she can either cure him, like rid him of the demon inside him, which will either kill him and or humanize him. We don't know what the end result will be. It's never fully indicated. And its setup and its execution is interestingly serious,
right,
and played normally, because it's not played for comedy and it's not played for horror.
I think it surprises people who have not seen a Blacula movie how serious the tone tends to be, right? Because when you hear that name, and even when they even do a couple of flashbacks to the original film here where he's first given the name Blacula, and you can roll your eyes at it, you really can. But because William Marshall brings such gravitas to the performance, it's easy to take him seriously in the role.
Yeah, completely. Definitely, and especially I think they flash back to that scene not only to explain the origin, but also to sort of look at the name as a curse almost.
Right.
And look at the name as, because he's also goes by the name of Prince Mamawalde.
Right.
And at a certain point in this movie where the person keeps calling him Mamawalde, he actually goes, "No, I'm Blacula," and it's almost like he's giving into that oppression, but also the demon. Like if you're using the demon as the vampire demon as a metaphor for his oppression, almost like Blacula is his slave name or something. Do you know what I mean?
You can absolutely, and you can kind of see that in his interactions too, because when he is being the part of Prince Mamawalde and he's at the party and he's interacting with people, this isn't in a lot of kind of traditional vampire movies when Dracula is being his like most charismatic self and very attractive and luring. It feels like it's part of a larger scheme to kind of attract people in so he can take advantage of them. But in this one, even though he does have an ulterior motive because he wants to connect with Lisa as a character, it seems like he actually is making those emotional connections, because he even has that scene with Justin where he's sitting across the table from him and Justin is basically accusing him of being the vampire. And instead of saying like, "I'm going to destroy you, I'm going to kill you," it's very much like, "You should back off of this because if you go any further, something bad's going to happen." So there is an element that he's like, "I'm not going to hurt you just because you're trying to figure out what's going on." It just kind of adds another layer of kind of respectability to this character. Again, I wish it's something that they explored in a little more detail, because this movie kind of ends in a very kind of sudden,
weird way. Yeah.
Yeah, really weird way. It almost feels like it wants to end just to justify the title, because it ends with Blacula screaming.
Right. Yeah, completely. And it's sort of a little odd because you really do. It's in there, but you have to read pretty heavily into it. But the idea that he is really, it's this idea that vampirism is this image of the African American as a savage or as a animal or as lesser than, right? And he doesn't want to give in to that. He wants to be Prince Mamuwalde. He wants to be this, and is, for most of the film, this elegant and well-spoken and so on and so forth. And it's other people that would make him this violent animal savage thing. And that's kind of the duality that's going on with him. And it also, when he beats up the two pimps, it's almost him saying the same, almost to himself, like, you shouldn't be giving into these base urges. Like, this is not what we are. Like, don't play into other people's hands. Like, you know, we're all better than this kind of thing.
There is a hypocritical element to it as well, to some extent, simply because of the fact that he physically has to give into that within himself. And it's something that he's trying to rid himself of. Like you said, yeah, you can definitely read that into this movie, and it makes it, I think, a lot more interesting when you do read that into it, that this is something that he's desperate to get rid of, and that he will go to extreme measures in order to do that. But he'll also, there's lines that even he won't cross, and there's respectability for his race that he still wants to like maintain, and he's very serious about. Yeah, because the characters that he tends to tend to be kind of junky asshole characters. And when I say junky, I don't mean drug addict junky. I just mean that they tend to be assholes.
Yeah, and I was just going to make sort of a similar point. This idea that well, I'll only turn the bad people, or I'll only I'll only try and I'll only kill and or educate the bad people. Which is sort of indicated in this film. It's not like they're not really bad people. I mean, you know, Willis wants to destroy Grier. I mean, Willis brings Blacula back to life because he wants to destroy Pam Grier's rightful place as a high voodoo priestess when the other one dies. But and it's more for him because, of course, he's the first one who is brought under Blacula's thrall and drained and turned. But I think if you wanted to have even more empathy for Blacula and you wanted to explore the story rather than, interestingly enough, the exploitation trappings of, well, we have to have a death every 5 minutes. You would have him eating maybe animals, or you would have him trying to have synthesized something or other. Like, he would be trying to survive without killing human beings if his entire purpose was to be better than the animal he's been made.
Because we certainly don't get much of an explanation of his curse in either movie, right? We don't really get a sense of, I mean, you know, maybe that's not possible for all sorts of different reasons. But again, if you dig into the kind of mythology, classic mythology of vampires, it kind of falls apart anyway if you think about it too much, right? This one it has the broad strokes. You can't be seen in mirrors. You don't show up on film. And it exists in a world where the Dracula myth is already something that people know. But again, it could so easily slide into ridiculousness if you didn't have that central performance. And I tell you, when I was watching this, even though, again, this is a flawed movie in a lot of different ways, it doesn't all hold together perfectly. What it really made me think was, I wish that we had a third Blacula movie, one where they could explore some of those things. Maybe make him like a full-blown, if not a hero, then maybe at least an anti-hero, right? Because it seems like that's what it feels like they're just resisting the urge to do that in this movie.
The After Movie Diner with Jon Cross will return right after this.
You're listening to us. And the face.
What's up, guys? This is Epic Film Guy Nick here, and I just want to take a few moments to tell you about an excellent podcast that I personally listen to called Ice and the Face. All right, now if you're a fan of dystopian and even nihilistic comedy, this is the show for you. Rick and Sarah take the most ridiculous news items in the world every single week, and they just tear these stories down, all while having a great laugh. They're usually joined by guests who jump right in on the fun, and it's just a great time. They just launched a Patreon over at patreon.com/iceintheface, so you can also support them. But if you're not listening to this show, what you need to do is go to their website at iceintheface.com, or jump over on your favorite podcasting app and subscribe to Ice in the Face. I promise you'll listen for 2 minutes and you will be hooked, just like I am. So go ahead and give it a listen.
Hi, do you want to Netflix and chill, but you're not popular enough to have a girlfriend? Check out Netflix and Swill, where you can get drunk alone and listen to us ramble on about shit that's on Netflix.
I've listened to Netflix and Swill for 2 whole episodes now, and they've helped cure my incurable loneliness. Thanks, Netflix and Swill, for letting me get so drunk and forgetting about all my problems.
You can trust him, he's unbiased.
I'm totally not a host for this show.
So hop over to netflixandswill.podbean.com or check us out on iTunes.
You're listening to the sweet sounds of the After Movie Diner. Support us at patreon.com/After Movie Diner. Or I'll punch you in the teats. Rate and review us on iTunes, Earthling.
I think that Don Mitchell and Michael Conrad's performance, although obviously Michael Conrad is the, shouty white symbol of, I can work with a black person, but I also am horribly racist and awful kind of character. Sort of a Dirty Harry-ish person, I guess. But they're, for what they're given to do, they're nice, strong, anchoring characters as well to some extent, in the sense that Don Mitchell is the guy who goes, he's sort of the, well, if it's not all these other explanations, it must be this. So once I've decided it's vampires, I'm just going to compile as much evidence as I can, and hopefully everyone's going to come along with me. And Michael Conrad is the skeptic who eventually sort of has to come along with him based on
I will say, I feel like Don Mitchell, his character, is evidence that it's a vampire that's doing these attacks, was probably too flimsy to bring to the police officer, but how lucky for him that while he was talking to the guy, they brought in those photos where all the victims had just vanished on them, which is as clear evidence as there could possibly be. But it is quite a jump that he makes to bodies drained of blood with bite marks on them to there is a vampire going around. Yeah. But at least he knew a guy who really fit the bill of a whole vampire persona. But
someone has to make that leap in a vampire movie, otherwise it never gets going. And the one thing you can say about this is it's a nice pacey movie. It doesn't kind of slow down. Something does happen every 5 to 10 minutes, and like you say, while the plot isn't particularly strong and fairly formulaic in parts, and while it doesn't entirely hold together, I mean, I wouldn't give this a 10 out of 10. It's more like a 7 out of 10 or a 6.5 out of 10. But sure. It at least is an entertaining hour and a half. It throws in a little bit of message here and there. You've got a Blacula you can empathize with. You've got Pam Grier, who's possibly going to save the day. And you've got this nice double act, I think, of Don Mitchell and Michael Conrad of, and the silliest the whole movie gets is twofold. It's when Michael Conrad looks at photos where clearly no one is in the stretcher and goes, well, maybe there's something wrong with the camera, right? Which has never been a thing ever, that a camera could erase people but keep
leave the background.
Yeah, leave the background. And the other ridiculous situation is where Blacula escapes from a party and turns into a bat because the police are arriving and he has no other choice but to turn into a bat. And a junkie and or someone who has had just a little bit too much booze in a doorway across the road looks in disbelief and kind of stumbles about, and the cut happens just as he goes, oh shit, like that, which is sort of like a nice little comical nod. Beyond that, though, it's fairly straight-faced, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really is. And again, people who have no experience with these movies might think that they're going to be a lot lighter than they end up being. But these, if this is a part of the Blaxploitation genre, then this is a Blaxploitation horror movie, right? This is a horror movie straight on through, and is meant to be taken seriously and does have those layers to it. And again, it's one of those things. I think a lot of people, when it comes to William Marshall's career, because he was a Shakespearean actor and he had such talent and he was so underutilized in a lot of movies, especially after this, that they think that it's almost an embarrassment that this is one of the roles that he's most connected with. This and the King of Cartoons from the Pee-wee show from the late 80s.
Right.
But I think there's something to be said for a character that almost no one else could truly envelop like he does, right? He makes it entirely his own, to the point where if say they tried to pitch a reboot of Blacula tomorrow, look, I'm not as anti-reboot or remake as some people are.
Me.
But as some people on this call. But I would say that, if they were going to do a Blacula movie in 2017, they would make it overtly comical. There's no way that they would make it straight-laced. And B, trying to find someone to play that role that would bring even a piece of the gravitas and intensity that he brings would be almost impossible. I just can't think of another actor.
You
could
wouldn't
really
do what Hollywood's been doing for the last 15 years and be like, oh, we need an elder statesman, African-American guy, Morgan Freeman.
Yeah, right? Morgan Freeman, the vampire. It's just, there's just no one. When I think of this character, this is the guy who's it. And I just can't. If someone else was playing it, it would just be a different character.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you look at something like the Hammer horror films, which I'm probably way more versed in terms of that. Although, no, I've probably seen as many Hammer horror films as I have Blaxploitation era films. But like first of all, Scream Blacula Scream is in no way a million miles away from a Hammer horror film. It's very close in tone and style to some extent, and is certainly more serious than AD 72. And thankfully for it, because I'm not a huge fan of AD 72. But everyone knows that Christopher Lee didn't want to play the part much beyond 2 films. But even under duress, when he shows up, he is everything you want him to be, and he plays it straight and plays it seriously. And Cushing as well is able to spout these incredibly ridiculous lines of dialogue, and they both make it seem like Shakespeare. And again, I love the fact that William Marshall takes that approach. I love the fact that the filmmakers behind this film took that approach with the character. It's almost sad that they are saddled with this somewhat ridiculous name of Blacula.
Sure.
Because I'm sure people see the names and think, well, that's in a lot of ways in the same way that people see Blaxploitation movies in general, and assume that it's all funk soundtrack, big loud clothing, and a lot of people, saying the word jive or something. You know what I mean? Like, they see it in that way. They don't understand, I think, or they don't care to watch more than 5 minutes of this stuff. It's almost become too parodied in like later, both in later films, but also in spoof films in general, that if a film is going to be set in the 70s, people are going to wear loud flares and there's going to be disco music, and whether it's white or black actors.
I mean, we see that because we're fans of genre cinema in general, right? I mean, we see that all the time. For people who are not well versed in even like the horror genre in general, they have this particular view of it because maybe it's from parodies, maybe it's from their just what they think it is, or maybe they've seen a couple of examples that kind of reflect that and reinforce it. But we know that within every genre, there's a huge, huge range, and within any era, there's a huge, huge range in terms of quality and in terms of subject matter. And the fact is that you could watch Shaft and see that as the kind of prime example of a Blaxploitation movie, but when you watch Scream Blacula Scream, how can you say that these are the same thing, right? They just don't relate to each other. There are elements of it, right? There are elements that you could probably connect between the two, but only in the same way that you could between a white horror movie, if you could call it that, and a white crime movie.
Right, of course. It's the same problem I have with people who are like, yeah, I love Evil Dead. I think it's really funny and I love to get drunk and watch it. And I'm like, but that's not why it's an amazing film. Like, if you have to be drunk or high to enjoy The Evil Dead, or if you have to be drunk or high to enjoy Scream Blacula Scream so you can sit back and be above it and scoff it, like, I have no interest in that whatsoever. And I think too many people think that way about 70s films, you know what I mean? They see the big collars and the wide trousers and they hear the funk guitar and they're like, yeah, that's funny, man. Yeah, let's all laugh at it. And this
is exactly the kind of movie that we can't, like, you can't go to like a revival house or a repertory cinema and show Scream Blacula Scream to an audience. I bet if you or I were sitting in that audience, we would be mortified and embarrassed because people would laugh all the way through it, because that's what they've been trained to do, right? That they can't take this seriously, that they can't see it for what it is, which is that it's a movie that is trying to do a lot of different things at once. And in some ways, it's a very revolutionary movie. And it's certainly a sequel to a movie that really was revolutionary. So that's the difficulty I have, same as you, that when you think you're above the art that you're watching, it means that you can't appreciate it on a level outside of that. All you can be is the person mocking it, and any quality that it has gets lost in that process.
Yeah, definitely. I agree completely. No, the only other point I had to say about it, we were talking about Pam Grier earlier in the role. Mm-hmm. It's definitely helped by the fact that it really doesn't matter what Pam Grier was doing in any film that she's ever been in, even when she's in very exploitation films like The Big Dollhouse and Women in Cages and stuff, and The Big Birdcage. She is a strong, powerful presence on screen, as both as a female and just as an actor in general. And there's no denying that. There are some people who it doesn't matter. There are some people, I've said this before, but there are some people, for example, who can do nudity, they can do action, they can do gore, and they maintain the power in the scene. Mm-hmm. And there are other people who, if they have to strip down, or if they have to do action, or if they have to do whatever, feel like they're being exploited.
Right.
At no point do you ever feel like Pam Grier is not in charge of what she's doing at any point in any of her films.
She has a very unique presence. I think the only problem with Scream Blacula Scream is that if you were to watch it and you heard, well, you have William Marshall here as Blacula and you have Pam Grier as one of the leads, that your brain is going to be like, oh, this is going to be Foxy Brown versus Dracula. And that's not what you really get.
No, it's more sort of deeper and more soulful. Yeah. She plays...
Right.
She plays a woman who is very powerful and has a lot of ability, but still has the confusion and the insecurity and the naivety of her age in the film and of her character in the film. And the fact that she's able to play both so successfully is what's impressive. I think, yes, if people go in expecting to see Pam wielding a sawn-off shotgun and kicking ass and taking names, they're going to be disappointed. But I don't need her to be doing that in order for her to kick ass and take names. She does that just by coming on screen for me. And there aren't many people who do. I think there are other Helen Mirren and Susan Sarandon and other people, I think, are people who can come on screen and have that sort of a power. I never feel like they're being exploited, even though all three actors have done a lot of nudity and a lot of sexuality on screen, and even a lot of violence in some cases. You never feel like they're the ones that are out of control,
Right, absolutely.
In that regard. And so, that's just one more aspect of it. Like you say, it's not a wholly successful film. There are bits where certainly with modern eyes you look back at and you go, God, I wish they'd tightened up the script here, or I wish they'd written this into it, or I wish whatever. But
I think it's kind of obvious that this movie was rushed into production after the success of the first one. I mean, it came out the year after. They were trying to strike while the iron was hot, and I think that's where you get things like a wonky ending, and some of the plot threads don't really go anywhere. And there's also lots of really bad day for night shooting in this movie.
Yeah.
But it is. When you appreciate that they were trying to do something interesting, even if it wasn't wholly successful, there's still lots to enjoy here.
Yeah, and when you think of some of the films that were made in this sort of 5-6 year period, the fact that, you just have to look at Grier's career, and she's doing Sheba Baby, Bucktown, and Friday Foster in 1 year. Right. You know what I mean? You're like, wow. There aren't actors now who do a film as good as Bucktown in 5 years of their career, 10 years of their career, and she's doing 3 of them in 1 year. Similarly with 1973, you have Black Mama, White Mama, Coffee, and Scream Blacula Scream. Like she was churning them out. So the fact that it's as good as it is, and the fact that Coffee is as good as it is fucking a miracle, and incredible, and a great testament to the filmmakers, the writers, and the actors of that era. And if nothing else, by doing these episodes, I just hope that our praise of this I don't think it's derided. I think it's got enough respect these days. I mean, certainly films like Jackie Brown put it back under the spotlight, and there was a lot of revisionist documentaries that came out and so on that you can find online to watch about this era now.
Sure.
Because off the back of that. But, when you see, Denzel Washington in the Magnificent Seven, or whatever it is, it's born on the back of this era, and people need to see these films and appreciate them much more for what they are, I think.
Sure. Yeah, these are the giants that they're standing on the shoulders of, right? And whether there are troublesome elements in this movie and things that maybe you don't appreciate or enjoy at this time, without these, then you could make the case very easily that we wouldn't have the something like having a lead role in a Western for a black actor now that isn't played for laughs, that's played completely straight.
And also, you think about it, it was very easy. The year that they kind of did a fairly, and I'm being cynical, but a fairly kind of African-American heavy Oscars, and I think Halle Berry won, and they gave Sidney Poitier the Lifetime Achievement.
Sure.
It's very easy to give Sidney Poitier a Lifetime Achievement if you're a Academy as pompous and ridiculous as the Oscars Academy is, because certainly the films he did were excellent, and he did pave the way for a lot of people. But they're easy films to respect because they are very clearly, obviously, about something.
Sure.
And he is very much the well-spoken, besuited, educated person in those films.
He's the most palatable version of what white audiences could expect at that time, because they were not trying to push any further than they needed to, or that they were willing to, or they didn't feel like the audiences would accept more than that. But the great thing about Poitier is that he opened a door, and then,
of course. I mean,
then just a couple of years later, you could have like Melvin Van Peebles kick the door open, right?
Of course, no, completely, and there was no disregard of Poitier, who's incredible. But what I was lining up to say is that we won't see Pam Grier, Fred the Hammer Williamson, Richard Roundtree, Jim Brown, Bernie Casey, any of these guys get a Lifetime Achievement Oscar, or even a posthumous Oscar, or even any industry recognition. And I know that's not necessarily important to people, and I'm not saying that it should be, but I'm just saying that there are a multitude of careers. For example, you saw Denzel Washington, Samuel L. Jackson, and I forget who the third guy was who stood. Oh, Wesley Snipes, sorry, who stood up and spoke very eloquently and correctly at Spike Lee's Academy. What did he get? It wasn't a lifetime achievement, but it was like it was one of those Oscars that they don't hold at the Oscars.
Honorary type thing. Yeah, I gotcha.
Which also Roger Corman got, and other people have got.
Sure.
And quite rightly so. But all four of those people on that stage, to some extent, are there because, Fred the Hammer Williamson and Pam Grier and people, all those people I listed, did what they did in a way.
Sure.
And I also keep going back to that era, not just on that basis, but also because the films are so much fun. They're so just good films to watch. The script to Shaft, for example, is as sharp and as interesting and as one-liner filled and as funny as almost anything Humphrey Bogart did as Marlowe or Sam Spade.
Sure.
And that's not an exaggeration. Like, some of the one-liners in Shaft are absolutely golden. And so anyway,
I also love, by the way, that these movies are so tight,
Yeah, completely.
90 minutes in and out.
Yeah.
In an era where every movie seems to be 2.5 hours, it's really refreshing to go back and see a movie that kind of even if there are parts of it that you're like, well, I'm not loving this as much as I like the other parts of the movie, you never have time to really get bored with what's going on.
No, indeed. I completely and utterly agree. And so with that, I hope that everyone listening to this will go back and, if not check out Scream Blacula Scream, at least check out this era just a little bit more. And hopefully we'll cover at least one, if not a couple more, African-American movies and or women in horror movies as this month progresses. But thank you ever so much, Doug, for being on the show. It was a pleasure to talk to you, as always. And let's do this again soon.
Please, let's do this again, John. I am always happy to come on, and I feel like when we're talking about a movie that we could literally talk all night about one fucking movie.
Yes, most definitely, or at least spread out into other topics. But what people don't know is we spoke for about half an hour on other topics before this. I have to go, but and you have to go. But thanks ever so much, dude, and let's stay in touch and talk soon.
Bye-bye.
Doug Tilley is the co-host of the No Budget Nightmares podcast, and also Eric Roberts is the Fucking Man podcast. Both of those are easy enough to find on iTunes, and Doug himself can be found on Twitter at Doug_Tilley. That's Tilley. Doug_Tilley on Twitter. Check him out.
You've been listening to the After Movie Diner with your host, Jon Cross.